Putin's going to have a rude wake-up call when his country goes broke and his people don't want to support this war anymore.
I mean, the wind blows the other way some of the time, and Ukraine is next door to Russia. So if there is a radiation cloud in southern Ukraine, it'll hit southern Russia in about 2 days' time, if that. And that is an enormous problem for all the Russians who live in Rostov-on-Don.
Keir Starmer ought to employ, along with all his other special advisors, perhaps a history advisor, to remind him what happened the last time a tyrant headed west.
It's incredible because in the post-World War II era, how many times have we redrawn the map through a war of aggression? Russia as a country only came into existence at the end of 1991.
Psychologically, I think the Ukrainian people, this will be massive. Storm Shadow, in effect, will prevent Putin being able to launch his tactical nuclear weapons.
Hello, I'm Peter Dukes, and this is Byline on the front line, and it's been a very busy week in Ukraine. So, first, let's find out more from Hamish de Breton Gordon, a serving army officer for 23 years and a chemical weapons expert. Hamish, what's your reaction to these new threats against NATO from Putin? And how do you think Western politicians are going to respond?
Well, it's not new. I mean, I think Putin is really rattled. He has been threatening escalation really since the get-go, since the 24th of February 2022. Last week, Lavrov, his foreign minister, was also threatening, really in reaction to the head of the CIA and head of MI6 saying that Russia was conducting sabotage threats across Europe and other nefarious activities. So, yeah, I think he's absolutely rattled. I think the West, I think in particular, Starmer, who's arrived in Washington to discuss with Biden ostensibly the use of long-range missiles, ostensibly the British Storm Shadow, they need to look at this. They need to understand that this is Putin's bluff and bluster. It is essential, in my opinion, that Ukraine is allowed to use Storm Shadow missiles for a whole host of reasons. The two main ones are being, first of all, to prevent the glide bombs, the hypersonic missiles being launched from deep in Russia that are attacking hospitals and schools and the infrastructure. Storm Shadow will stop that. Secondly, is the nuclear threat, the escalation of nuclear. Now, which I think has been stymieing decisions across Europe and is something that Starmer is trying to get his head around. And David Lammy, of course, was in Kyiv this week. Storm Shadow, in effect, will prevent Putin being able to launch his tactical nuclear weapons. They need to be close to the Ukraine border. They only have a range of about 400 miles. And Putin knows that with Storm Shadow, then his threats are absolutely without foundation. So I hope that Biden and Starmer are bold, go ahead. And if I could just use a sort of football vernacular, by giving Storm Shadow to Ukraine and limiting its use, it's like organising a football match between Ukraine and Russia and saying Ukraine can only have a goalkeeper. It's ridiculous. And bold decisions now, I think, in Washington are much more likely to end this war quickly than prevarication and timidity, which has never won wars. Boldness has always won.
So we hear a lot about Russian disinformation, Hamish. And is it working, I wonder? Because, as I mentioned, one of the things the disinformation tries to sow is nuclear psychosis. And there's been a lot of reaction to Putin's latest threats, kind of hysteria almost, in the British press and among the commentariat in America. What do you make of that?
Absolutely. The disinformation and propaganda that Russia has put out, that they are the masters of this. They are brilliant, if that is not an oxymoron. And I think, the timid West has been cowed by it. The fact that we have drip-fed weaponry into Ukraine for the last 2.5 years is because an awful lot of people are believing the stuff coming out of Russia. And it's one of those things, quantity has a real quality in this particular case. The quantity of this stuff coming out of Russia is unbelievable. And the ability for governments like the British government to react to it are very slow and marginal at best. It's only sort of free commentators and analysts like myself who can react quickly, but we're not speaking for the governments. So absolutely, I think in the information war, and I think it's something that is new. This information war, everybody says, has the war that we're seeing in Ukraine, has that changed war forever? No, the tank battles in the Donbass are the same as the tank battles in the First World War. But what is new is the tsunami of information, tsunami of disinformation that people are picking up. And of course, there are Russian bots, as it were, Russian supporters hiding within the Western press, which only the few know who they are. So, the fact that you're hearing commentators like me really sprouting Russian propaganda saying we need to de-escalate, Ukraine needs to come to the negotiation table and sue for peace, is desperately sad. And I hope people listen to people like me who are saying we need to be bold and get this over quickly, rather than capitulate and appease the Russians.
So if Ukraine doesn't get the permission to use these long-range weapons, Hamish, what do you think happens next?
Well, I think that there are a number of things really linked to the last point. Psychologically, I think for the Ukrainian people, this will be massive. They are the ones at the front line. They're the ones taking the casualties. And if their so-called allies cannot give them the wherewithal to defend against this illegal invasion, I think that will have a profound effect on their morale and ability to resist. Conversely, I think if we do not allow Storm Shadow and others to be used, it will help Putin, and it will help the morale of the people he's trying to influence. Because it's only recently that the mothers of Russia are beginning to realise what is happening. And of course, it was the mothers of Russia who brought the Afghan war to an end. When 17,000 Russian soldiers were killed, it was the mothers who marched on the Kremlin who really made the Russian leadership at the time withdraw from Afghanistan. Now, this is on a different scale. Even the most conservative estimates are putting it at 600,000 Russian casualties, majority dead. Now, how the mothers of Russia hadn't realised that and hadn't marched on the Kremlin, a lot of it goes back to the previous point about disinformation. Most of these young men, and it is young men, dying on the front lines in the Donbass are actually from Eastern Russia or from the prisons, who the elite in Moscow and St. Petersburg care very little for. Once the sons of the elite start dying on the front lines, things will be different. So, it is, for a whole host of reasons, it's essential that Biden and Starmer give the go-ahead. Maybe not today, and maybe in secret today, but because it will have a profound tactical effect on the ground and a strategic psychological effect in Moscow, London, Paris, and Washington.
So, Hamish, you mentioned in your recent article that it would be easier to defeat the Russians in the fields of Russia rather than the towns and cities and fields of Europe. I don't think people really understand these comparisons sometimes and think about what the consequences would be were Putin to advance. Could you just go into some more detail about this point?
Absolutely. In my article, I also suggested that Sir Keir Starmer ought to employ, along with all his other special advisors, perhaps a history advisor to remind him what happened the last time a tyrant headed west. Hitler back in 1939. And we and others in Europe tried to appease Hitler, and again, he, with his disinformation campaign, persuaded many of our leaders that he was not the threat he was. 6 years later, we managed to defeat Hitler with the mass provided by Americans and ourselves, but also hundreds and hundreds of thousands of casualties. had Hitler been defeated in Poland back in 1939, we'd be in, the Second World War would evolve very differently. Now, I'm not saying that it's exactly the same now, but we have a massive Russian army. They've lost 600,000, but there is 600,000 Russian troops in Ukraine at the moment, and they've lost a hell of a lot of kit for sure. But the point being is, again, using the football vernacular, as it were, that actually, if we can defeat them in the east of Ukraine and the west of Russia, where around Kursk, where the fighting is, or enable Ukraine to do it, then we won't have to be doing it ourselves. Because if Ukraine falls, I don't think anybody who looks at this with any detail thinks that Putin will stop there. In fact, the key thing is, Putin told us he was going to invade Ukraine. He keeps telling us. He tells us that Britain is next on the list. And if that's not a wake-up call, although at the beginning I was saying he's bluffing and he's a liar, well, most of the time he is. But when he says something so directly, we must react to it. And it is much better. And also, we need to realise that the British military is so denuded and so small as the peace dividend from the Cold War that actually, if we got involved in a tank battles with the Russians, we wouldn't last very long. So it's essential that they're stopped where they are now and sent whence they can, rather than capitulate and delay and dither and have to fight them ourselves on the ground in Europe, as we did Hitler back in the 40s.
And we're delighted now to be joined by a new guest, Jake Bross. He was a United States Air Force officer who served on nuclear and missile operations and has recently amassed 500,000 YouTube subscribers for his analysis of the Ukraine war. So this week, Blinken arrived in Ukraine, Jake, and he gave an entire speech about Crimea being Ukrainian. And what was your reaction to that?
We must respect the rules of international law. Crimea is the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. Whatever happened in the past, it doesn't matter. Russia as a country only came into existence at the end of 1991. Whatever happened under the old Soviet system, Khrushchev transferring this from one internal province of their empire to the other, it's irrelevant. The past is the past. We're not going to investigate every country's historical claims because there's a lot of countries in the world with gray borders and historical claims, but 1991, that was the cutoff. So this is the appropriate action from world leaders. I appreciate the statements from the leader of Turkey. What Secretary Blinken says is correct. What Russia has done is incredible because in the post-World War II era, how many times have we redrawn the map through a war of aggression? New countries have come into existence from bigger states basically dissolving. But for one country to invade and then annex the territory of another country, the list of people who attempted to do this in the last 70 years, it didn't end well for them. You can ask Saddam Hussein when he invaded Kuwait. So the international community has been holding together for the last 2.5 years. Not even China is willing to recognize Russia's claims to Crimea and the annexed territories. So Putin's going to have a rude wake-up call when his country goes broke and his people don't want to support this war anymore.
So how do you think Putin is feeling at the moment? There was talk of the walls closing in. There's a lot of bad news. 144 drones hit Moscow. There's inflation, the interest rates are going up. And Kursk, Russian territory, has been invaded for at least a month. How do you think he's personally coping in terms of his psyche and his psychology?
Well, I think Putin has extreme confidence in that he's been able to pull this off for the last 2.5 years. This entire war has been disastrous every single step. The second it was apparent to everyone in the world this was not going to be a 3-day special military operation, in my mind, Russia lost this war the second President Zelensky declined that helicopter ride out of the country. As soon as the Ukrainians rallied behind their own president and decided they wanted to fight, how do you do it? How do you invade a country with only 200,000 soldiers in the beginning and try to conquer a nation of over 40 million people? active resistance, the clips and pictures and videos those first couple weeks. So your question about what is Putin thinking and feeling now, I think Putin is shocked that for the last 2.5 years he's been able to get away with this. Hundreds of thousands of his own people have died in this war. Countless more have been crippled for life. Hundreds of thousands of Russians have fled the country for sanctuary or a better life in other countries like Turkey, Jordan, Thailand, if they can get a visa into Western countries in Europe. So Putin has gone this far, and nobody's really stopped him. The only real opposition he's had is that brief mutiny by Prigozhin. His personal chef is the only one in his inner circle that has attempted to rebel against him. So Putin, I mean, he's fully committed. He's either, in his mind, going to win or he's going to be murdered by his own people. So he's fine continuing to write checks to keep this war going. He's fine with his own people dying. He's fine with his own country being invaded because he still thinks politically he'll win the long game. When you look at recent elections in Germany, when you look at everything Donald Trump says and does here in the United States, and the election here is still close, it's basically a coin flip. Putin's feeling confident that if he just keeps letting his own people die, if he keeps the war machine going, eventually he can grind down Ukraine and he'll get a tangible victory.
So there's a lot of talk about firing these long-range weapons. Is this a big moment in the war if Ukraine is allowed to use these weapons in Russia, in the heartland of Russia? Do you think this is a major escalation or a major turning point?
The implications are nothing good for Russia, but Russia's not going to do anything. We have discovered over the last 2.5 years that every red line that Russia has made is non-existent. The arrival of Leopards or Abrams, the arrival of Patriot systems, the arrival of F-16s, the initial permission 4 months ago to use Gimler's rounds within 100 kilometers on Russian territory. The United States is still going to impose restrictions on the use of ATACMS or, for example, British Storm Shadow cruise missiles. Don't hit thermal power plants with them. Don't hit oil refineries. Don't hit oil depots. Those are purely civilian targets, even though obviously they contribute to the Russian war machine. But any military bases, anything that is indisputably a valid military target, yes, they're going to start getting lit up the next 2 weeks, and it's going to be a bad month for the Russians as far as their logistics supply chains. If you can make things go boom and set them on fire 300 kilometers deep into Russia, well, now supplies, now troop rotations going into the occupied territories, getting to the front lines. Yeah, there's going to be a trickle-down effect, and this will improve Ukraine's position on the battlefield.
So we've got to ask the question, it's taken over 2 years for the West to allow Ukraine to strike with these long-range weapons. What do you think has changed? Why is it only happening now?
Fear of nuclear war. But also, I'm convinced that when we talk about the West is not fully united.
Yeah.
If you talk to former Soviet republics or the Scandinavian countries, Eastern Europe, their opinion of the Russians is a little bit different than if you get farther west. And we need to have a broader conversation about Russian money infiltrating our democracies and corrupting us. The ties that the West made with the Russians will buy your gas and natural resources in exchange, as long as the oil and gas keeps flowing. We'll overlook your backsliding into authoritarianism. All the signs were there, from the 2008 election in Russia to Putin coming back in 2012. It's not normal to amend your constitution so the guy in charge can stay there for life. That's not a democracy. But what the Russians have been doing the last 20 plus years is investing, buying property, entrenching their own mafia state into our Western democracies. So the business ties, the connections, the money is there everywhere in every Western capital. It's not just one country that's at fault or at risk here. So this entire time, it's all been about how can we get back to business as normal? Now, on my YouTube channel, I've been making the argument for 2.5 years that's never going to happen. make the divorce permanent. I follow Gary Kasparov, and I agree with what he says. The Russian people will never be free, will never have normal relations again until the Putin regime collapses. Make it happen faster. Don't fear it. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and the world is better off. Let's go for it.
So, Jake, what do you think would actually happen if Putin was toppled? I mean, and, Russia would be destabilized, but the whole Soviet Union fell apart in 1991 and we didn't have World War III. So I know people are scared of any thought of, rogue nukes and a destabilized Russia. But what do you think would actually happen if Putin's project and his sort of grip loosens?
Let's be honest about this debate. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the mandate was have all the nukes go back to Russia. Those are now Russia's nukes. So Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine had Soviet nuclear weapons on their territory. And part of the deal to have this peaceful collapse of the Soviet Empire was all the nukes have to retreat back into mainland Russia. Well, if Russia breaks up, if Russia collapses, where do the nukes go? There is no inner core territory. I mean, I guess you could create a new country of Moscovia and then say that 6,000 nuclear warheads spread across, the Caucasus and Siberia have to retreat there. I guess that's a plan. But the fear is that if Russia fails and breaks up, we'll have regional warlords fighting over gas fields and mineral deposits, and they all have nuclear weapons. So that's the fear, that's the concern. In that nightmare scenario, millions would die, mostly Russians. To my response to that is Putin didn't give us a choice. I don't want that future. I don't want millions to die in some kind of regional nuclear war. But we can't just let Putin have whatever he wants. Appeasing a dictator never prevents the next war.
So in the presidential debate this week, Kamala Harris basically said that if Donald Trump was in power and he'd got what he wanted, Putin would be sitting in Kiev right now, and his next sort of point of mission, this need for constant war, he'd be looking to Poland. Do you think that's legitimate? Also, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. Do you think that was a real danger if Putin had managed to take Ukraine in those 3 days as he planned?
I don't have to think that. I don't have to have that opinion. All I have to do is listen to the Russians and what the Russians say on Kremlin state TV. I've been following these clips from Russian Media Monitor the last 2.5 years. I believe the Russians when they say they're going to attack Poland next. I believe Solyov when he says it was a mistake for Russian troops to ever leave Berlin and they need to go back. Now, when they say we're going to take our tanks all the way to Portugal, I don't think that's going to happen. But as far as the Suwalki Gap, as far as closing that bridge between Belarus, which is basically Russian territory, and Kaliningrad, of course the Russians are going to do that. They're going to cut off the Baltics and they're going to take the Baltics next. They don't care how many Polish people they kill. The Russians, for 400 years, have never cared how many Polish people they kill. So yes, I believe the Russians when they say they're going to keep going if they take Ukraine. And Donald Trump doesn't care. Donald Trump will sell out any ally in the world if it pleases the wealthiest dictators of the world. Donald Trump is a dictator wannabe. He's not very good at it. He's not very competent. He lost in 2020 and was removed from power. And he's not going to be allowed to come back by the American people this November.
So, Jake, I want to ask you about the Tenet scandal that unfolded last week about these social media super spreaders getting sort of millions in payments. It's one of the clearest pieces, small, apparently, there's much more, of Russian interference in Western democracies in recent years, really. Since the Cold War, you could almost say. Did it surprise you when you read about these right-wing personalities taking Kremlin gold?
It didn't surprise me, but I'm here on YouTube every day battling, and I look at my channel and I look at my views and I look at the limits of what one human being can do on their own. I have over 500,000 subscribers. I average 300,000 views a video. I'm doing pretty well. So when I look at a channel like Tim Pool and I see how nice his studio is, and he's got a producer, and he's got editors, and he's got a staff, and he's got vintage Magic the Gathering cards worth tens of thousands of dollars in a display case behind him in his camera shot. And the stuff he says and does is absolute garbage, and he barely gets any views. It didn't make sense to me. It hasn't made sense to me for 2.5 years. So to get this DOJ indictment unsealed and realize, to see on Kremlin State TV, Margarita Simonyan bragging about their covert operations in the United States, how for just a couple $1 million tossed here and there, they were able to get tens of billions of views out of these right-wing influencers here in the United States promoting Kremlin talking points. Now, 90% of their content, they talk about the culture wars, they talk about random conspiracy stuff to suck people in, but RT got a return on their investment. In the group chats, in that Discord server, they would put out, hey, we want you to promote this video of Tucker Carlson going to a grocery store in Moscow. Hey, we want you to just say Ukraine was behind the Crocus City Hall attacks. And these influencers were willing to do it. They were saying, I'm getting $100,000 a week from this weird company and doesn't make any sense, but yeah, I'll do it. They're paying me a lot of money. I'll just say Ukraine was behind this terrorist attack. I'll say Ukraine, it's their fault for starting this war because of NATO expansion. And for me as an American, I'm devastated that I've lost tens of millions of my compatriots. Tens of millions of Americans have now been radicalized by these right-wing influencers taking millions from the Russians to just think Ukraine is this is what Tim Pool said, Ukraine is the greatest enemy of the United States in the world today. The United States owes an apology to Russia. Tens of millions of Americans now believe this because their favorite right-wing influencers have been saying it for the last year.
So, Jake, finally, can I just ask you about the sort of physical situation on the ground in Ukraine right now? You know, there seem to be retreats, advances in the wrong way from as far as the Ukrainians are concerned in the east around Pokrovsk. Our reporters were there last week, and it seems that city could fall. And it's a huge railway city. It connects other towns along the ridge of Kramatorsk and Slovyansk. And of course, the Russians apparently have started a counteroffensive against the Ukrainian incursion into the Kursk Oblast of Russia. But what do you see the situation from your point of view? What's really going on the ground?
On my channel, I'm not a big map update guy. I do it for significant changes, but this war is not going to be won or lost with map updates. If the Russians take the city of Pokrovsk, the war is not over. If the Russians take the entirety of the Donetsk Oblast, the war is not over. The front lines have just shifted. The war will end when either Ukraine or Russia has some kind of catastrophic economic or political collapse, and they can no longer regenerate their frontline forces. This is what Ukraine has to do to win, and they've been doing it. With the targeting of all these oil refineries, they're going after Russia's money source. Every sanction, each sanction on their own is not going to do it, but it's a cumulative effect. It's a death by 1,000 paper cuts. So everybody in the West has to keep up the pressure on every sector, in every way. You know, the United States announcing their 18th round of sanctions or whatever, keep doing it. Keep targeting people, keep targeting companies. It's all aggregated. Just the other day, Google is now blocking all Russian telephone numbers. Apple and iOS already pulled out of Russia. How do you use the modern internet, avoiding both iOS and Android? All Apple and now all Google devices. Everything is getting worse in Russia. And I hope that we can come to some kind of culmination point this winter. It was disastrous for the Russian civil infrastructure last winter with pipes bursting, and they didn't have enough parts. They didn't have enough repair crews. We're heading into another difficult winter for the Russians. And I hope there will be a breaking point, either economically, politically, or socially. And that's how Ukraine's going to win. It's not going to be by overwhelming force. on the battlefield, clearing tree line by tree line or destroyed settlement by destroyed settlement.
Thanks so much for your great insights. Lovely to have you on Byline on the front line for the first time, and we hope to have you back again soon. So, John, one of the things I keep on banging on about is that in those FBI documents, the second lot, the warrants for taking down these doppelganger Russian sites, there was communications with the presidential office, and they talked about one of their aims of their disinformation and propaganda was to create nuclear psychosis in the West. I mean, you've seen the news today and the sort of hysteria around Putin's threats, nuclear threats around Ukraine being able to use these long-range weapons. Do you think that might actually have effect, that this nuclear psychosis might stop the West allowing Ukraine to strike back?
Yeah, so the context is that what's happening here is that Russia keeps on firing rockets at Ukraine, and it's worked out that, for example, Kyiv is heavily defended and well defended, and so therefore it's taking out much smaller targets, and it's killing innocent people again and again. So the issue is, can the Ukrainians fire back? And one analogy that people are using is, don't try and stop the arrow, fire at the archer, which means firing at where the missiles are coming from in Russia. And the anxiety the Americans have got is if they do that, that'll trigger the Russians to escalate maybe to nuclear war. And I doubt that very, very much. Listen, I'm attached to life and living as much as everybody else is, but I do look at what's happening in the world, and what's happening is that in September 22, when everybody was very worried about this, including the director of the CIA, who Burns, who talked about it the other day, they were worried about it. But what happened was, the first Chinese official to worry about this openly was the deputy head of mission at the Chinese embassy at the United Nations in New York, who said there should be no nuclear adventurism on either side. Ukrainians haven't got nukes. So he's talking about the Russians. Then the Chinese foreign minister says it, and then a few days later, there's a Tyrants Are Us conference in Samarkand with Modi and the Ayatollahs and Putin and Xi. And Chairman Xi says no nuclear adventurism. The reason is that the Chinese have got their economy is in trouble. They're blowing up blocks of houses because there's been a massive housing bubble. Weirdly, in a kind of very authoritarian country, it's because local councils and local government have been building and building and building a real boom that's popped, and so they're very, very worried that any nuclear thing that Putin might do will tank the world economy. So I don't think it's going to happen. By the way, MI6 and the CIA are pussy when it comes these days to going around killing people. The Chinese secret police don't give a monkeys about the stuff that we care about. And so when Xi says to Putin, no nuclear adventurism, he means it. And if he does it, then the Chinese will have his guts for garters. So I don't think that's realistic. So what we're looking at here is we're trying to reduce the number of Ukrainian civilians who are being murdered by the Russians. And I think it's perfectly proper to say, stop it. And here are the missiles, and the Ukrainians can use their missiles. Now, the Ukrainians have been extremely disciplined so far. Good on them. They have always sought to hit military targets, not civilian targets. Good on them. It is a war. But during the Second World War, for example, in the run-up to D-Day, the RAF and the American Air Force bombed all of the railway connecting points, but in particular in Paris. And they killed about 10,000 French civilians in Paris because they were seeking to knock out railway stations, and in particular where trains from the west and the south met in Paris. Now, that's a terrible thing to do, but you're trying to defeat Nazi Germany. So in the same way, we are, or rather not in the same way, we fought big war against Nazi Germany, and we're not allowing the Ukrainians to take the war to Russia. Now, by the way, all that will happen is that the Ukrainian targets will hit the Russian rocket bases, and then they will stop firing rockets at Ukraine. And the second thing I was thinking about is that there is a mass of redundant tanks and, in particular, armored cars sitting in the desert, I think in Arizona or New Mexico, where it's very, very dry, the stuff doesn't rust, and it's just sitting there. Now, what you could do is you could send that stuff to Ukraine, and then America could start building new things, so it would help the American economy. But it would send a message to Putin: no, you're not going to win this. So the sooner you get out of Ukraine, the better. If it's going to be a situation where you don't have the political will in the West to really support Ukraine this way, at least what happens is that Russia doesn't move anywhere forward, because what you're doing is you're making a significant show of force, of sending that to the Ukrainians so that they can match the Russians. And this means that the war will stop quicker, because the Russians will realize they're not going to win. So, and who's the problem here? I think the problem is Joe Biden. Joe Biden is, he is very, very old, and he was brought up during the Cold War. So his whole kind of, his muscle memory is all about staving off nuclear, complete nuclear obliteration. We're not there on this. We're not there. If Russia uses a nuclear weapon against Ukraine, I mean, the wind blows the other way some of the time, and Ukraine is next door to Russia. So if there is a radiation cloud in southern Ukraine, it'll hit southern Russia in about 2 days' time, if that. And that is an enormous problem for all the Russians who live in Rostov-on-Don, which is one of the big cities of Russia, etc., etc., etc. So the idea that this is going to happen, it's not. So it's a silly fear, but we're dealing with a playground bully, and the worst thing you can do with a playground bully is to show fear, and that's what the West is doing at the moment.
John, why have the West retrospectively appeased Putin for so long? We saw Georgia, 2008, he invaded it. We had the invasion of Syria, and 2014, when he, basically took over Crimea and eastern Donbass. We were too scared to confront him then, and then he unleashed, Novichok, a chemical agent in Britain and our center of our military establishment in Salisbury, and the Skripal attacks. Meanwhile, ever since then, for the last 10 years, he's been polluting our airways with his propaganda. We know he tries to interfere in elections. He gives funding to right-wing parties across Europe. Just going back, and you watched this for so long, why has the West been so weak to deal with Putin over all this time? And, coming right to this moment of giving Ukrainians permission to use these missiles?
There are two reasons, Peter. The first of which is Russian gold, and the second is fear of calling out the Russian bully. So the gold, that matters. Russia is or has been one of the world's biggest providers of oil and gas, in particular to Europe. Actually, Britain doesn't take that much Russian oil and gas, but of course, because Europe's buying it, then we have less now, and it means that a lot of that Russian gold has been parked in the City of London, and yes, it goes through a lot of tax havens and sunny places with shady people, but it ends up where the Russians know their money's safe, and one of those places is London. So there was a real anxiety not to really fall out with Putin, lest he switch off that drip of gold, not a dripper, that flow of gold into London and parking in London. The problem with that is that we've let him get away with murder again and again and again and again and again. And for example, after the the poisoning of Litvinenko with polonium-210 in 2007, we expelled 4 Russian diplomats. Putin doesn't give a monkeys about that. Not a monkeys about it. All it means is he has to print four new diplomatic passports. He's got lots of spies, lots of spy schools. He just pumps out 4 more spies. Terrific. After Salisbury, there was a lot of to-do, a lot of noise about it, kind of quite rightly. But what did we do practically? We expelled in total something like 120 Soviet spies from across the Western world. And again, all Putin has to do is hit print on his diplomatic passport printing machine 120 times. What we should have done is kick Russia off the international banking system. The problem with that, of course, is that if we were to do such a thing, then it would cost us money. But we're now in a different situation since February the 24th, 2022, the big war. It is bleeding obvious what's happening is that Putin, for his own domestic reasons, sees a threat in the success of democratic Ukraine. He cannot bear that to happen for his own internal political reasons as much as anything else, and also because of his own crazy Russian, greater Russian imperialist ideology. So he's attacked another country and he's seeking to gobble bits of that. Now, that's not allowed in the rules-based order, effectively, since 1914, when we went to war against the Kaiser's Germany, because he invaded Belgium. So we cannot allow this to stand, and we've got to support Ukraine. And I'm compared to Trump, Biden is far better, but he has been too fearful and too geriatric and too timid. And when you deal with a playground bully, you just have got to say, fuck off. And you have to mean it. And listen, if you're too small, you have to go and get your bigger friends to help you out. But the problem is, if the bigger friends are afraid of the bully, then you have a problem. And that's where we are right now.
So thanks everybody for watching Byline on the Frontline. And if you want to support us, no, we don't get any Kremlin gold, sadly. All we have is you, your support. You can donate on YouTube, you can subscribe to Byline TV, or indeed buy the next edition of Byline Times, which is all about Putin and Musk and Trump and Farage. We need your support to keep on making these programs with our great producers and contributors. So do, if you can, sign up at Byline TV, donate on YouTube, or buy Byline Times.